All right, so we're into part two of Commonwealth and Empire. So we're on slide 5. So the story's going to get rather depressing, rather intense, but you guys have to know this. This is about your country and the legacy we're still dealing with today uh, about racism. So the Civil War ends in 1865. The slaves are freed. And we talked very intently about Reconstruction, this period of time, about 12 years after the Civil War. For a while, there's a glimmer of hope for African Americans. It looks like perhaps there's going to be equality under the law. We have 3 constitutional amendments, civil rights legislation. Alas, it was not to be. When Reconstruction falls apart in the 1870s and 1880s, what emerges after that is this period of time that unfortunately we refer to as the era of Jim Crow. Now I say unfortunately because it has no punch, it has no sting. It doesn't really capture the essence of just how atrocious the system was, just appallingly grotesque. We know about this period. It's commemorated in our art. If you guys have read To Kill a Mockingbird, it's set in the 1930s, right in the middle of this Jim Crow era, but unless you study it from a historical perspective and you look at it in its totality, you really don't grasp just how awful the system was. This is very appropriate because Monday is Martin Luther King Day, and I want you to know what you're celebrating when you're celebrating Martin Luther King Day. A lot of Americans have not a complete understanding of this man. Martin Luther King, we'll study him later, essentially freed a nation, freed African Americans from this type of oppression where they lived essentially as second-class citizens. So, Reconstruction falls apart. What that basically means is the federal government is no longer going to come to the aid of African Americans living in the South to enforce their rights against the states that they live in. So, the best way to really think of this is that this is a form of almost colonial oppression, that the British, the French, the Dutch, they went overseas, they conquered peoples in Africa and Asia, took their land, took away all of their political rights, and oppressed them to extract wealth, to make them poor, to make white British people at home wealthy at the expense of dark-skinned peoples in the empire. It's the same thing, it's just African Americans were within the United States itself. They were supposed to be citizens, but states in the South essentially enacted this incredibly oppressive system, and it was very effective. It did exactly what these southern states wanted to do. It's probably better to refer to this system as American apartheid, have some other name that has a punch to it, but here's the 4 levels of this sort of colonial oppressive system. So first, A, physical intimidation. You have to understand that in the South during Jim Crow, there was an incredibly elaborate racial, social system. And it's too complex to even cover in its totality, but I'll give you a few pieces of understanding of this. So first, black and white interaction. Now, you have to understand that in the South, every town, pretty much every town, has black and white within it. If you're out of the Appalachian Mountains, if you're in the Deep South, every town has black people and white people living in it. Sometimes in a very close and intimate setting. My grandmother was born in Oma, Mississippi in 1923. They had a black woman live with them in the back bedroom. Now, you could do that. You could have black people living under the same home as you as long as they were in an inferior relationship, as long as you were their boss and you were they were your employee. So, my grandmother had a black woman essentially help raise her. She was sort of the maid. Their family was middle class. Pretty much every middle class white family had some sort of maid that would come over, scrub the floors, clean the toilets, raise the kids, and sometimes even stay overnight and live with them. And that was fine as long as you paid them. Blacks and whites could not sit together on a train car as equals, but a white person could have a black servant, paid, not a slave, but paid, and that was perfectly legal. That was fine. But if a black person is trying to assert some form of social equality with a white person, then there would be vast, vast repercussions. So for instance, if you are a black person and you are on a sidewalk in a southern town and a white person approaches you, you were not allowed to look at that white person in the eye, start a conversation, refer to them as a social equal, just refer to them by their first name. You could not do any of those things. You were supposed to. If you were a black man and there's a white woman approaching you, you were not even to look at her. You were supposed to avert your eyes, step off of the sidewalk into the gutter, take your hat off, and avert your eyes. If the woman says good morning to you, usually she'd refer to you by your first name. Good morning, Jim. Good morning, Joe. You had to call the white woman Missy, mistress. Even though there's no slavery anymore, you absolutely had to do those things. For instance, let's say there is a black family, sharecroppers that live on a white person's land. Okay, you know these people. They're, I hesitate to call friends, but you're at least friendly with them. And let's say that you drive into town. Every southern plantation society has a town where you can go and buy things. Let's say you go into town and you see a member of this black family there. They've walked the 4 or 5 miles into town. You've driven. You might be nice and you offer them a ride in your truck. You could never have a black person sit in the cab of the truck, in the portion where you sit indoors next to you in the shotgun position. You couldn't do that. They had to sit in the back of the truck like they were livestock. And if you drove through a southern town with a black person sitting next to you, everyone would start asking questions about that. There would literally be town meetings about why you were breaking these social norms. You can't do these things. These things are taboo. They're unspoken of. So what if you did these things? Well, there was this elaborate system that historians will refer to as physical intimidation, essentially lynching. And lynching, we don't like to talk about it. It's a very unpleasant topic. There's a lot of myths wrapped up into it. So, first, Southerners have myths that protect their culture. No one wants to look at this and imagine it was as horrible as it was, and so they try to brush it aside with these excuses. So, excuse number one is the myth of the black criminal, usually the black rapist. And so, today, many white Southerners would say, look, lynching was a terrible thing, we're not proud of it, but these were bad people. These were people with serious accusations. They were murderers, they were rapists. If you see the movie The Green Mile, Mr. Coffee, who is in jail, is accused of killing 2 little white girls. He's a black man. They don't lynch him, they arrest him, but they beat him up, they treat him rather brutally. And these are the accusations. Now, in reality, this is not the case. That's not to say there was no such thing as any black man ever raping anybody in the South at this time, but the vast majority, vast majority, were not accused of anything as bad as that. It was usually a black man looking at a white woman, right? And by looking, I mean, you know, checking her out, so to speak. Now, you haven't done anything really illegal. This is not a violation of the legal code, it's a violation of the social code, that he is acting as if he is equal with us, therefore he has to go. Second, is that there's a mythology about lower class people did this stuff. Look, this doesn't represent Southern culture, that yes, people were lynched, but they were lynched by backwoods people, rednecks. It didn't represent mainstream Southern culture. We know this to be false as well. We know that lynchings were very public, that city fathers, prominent officials were always present. Lynchings were often photographed, recorded in different ways, and we know that to be false as well. Now, how do we know these things? Well, first of all, we know from statistics that 1/3 of lynch victims were female. And so this explodes the myth of the black rapist, that a lot of black women were lynched simply for speaking out, accusing white people of social wrongdoing, and that was just considered beyond the pale. You couldn't do those things. 1/3, 30% of lynch victims were black women. Second, the notion that backwoods people did this, we know that to be false because unfortunately we still have handbills where they would advertise lynchings. The black person would be arrested, detained, held usually until some sort of huge event, Easter, Palm Sunday. This shocks one. This is grotesque, but this is how it was done. Lynchings were not hidden from the public. The South put itself out there saying, we endorse this. This person did an unspeakable act, and they're going to be punished for it. You would have carnivals, cotton candy, Ferris wheels, roller coasters. The priest or the minister of the local Baptist or Methodist congregation would come out and give a blessing and a benediction, and then the highlight of the carnival would be the lynching of the black victim. We know that railroad companies advertised lynchings and would give you discount rates. So if you were, one state over, you're in Alabama, you want to go to Mississippi to visit a lynching, they would advertise these in handbills and say, if you, want a ticket from Birmingham to Jackson, Mississippi, we're going to give you a discount because there's a lynching next week. And people would, of course, go and attend these things. They were very public. They were photographed, so they weren't done in the backwoods. They were done right out in the open with the blessings of everyone in the community, with prominent members. We also know that they were not spontaneous. That's the third myth, is that these couldn't be stopped because they were such, horrible crimes that this person committed, and so the lynch mob would just get to the person and just, kill him right there on the spot. No time to calm down, heat of passion. We know this to be false because, as I said, they were advertised. Usually the sheriff would go out, accusations would be made, this person did something against the social code. They would be arrested, detained, held for weeks, months, until the next event, and then cold-bloodedly killed. The fourth myth is that lynch victims were hanged by and large, which is not the most painful way to die and be executed. We know this to be false. We know that probably, unfortunately, this is terrible, but unfortunately the most prominent way, the most common way that lynch victims met their death was being burned at the stake. A medieval form of punishment, probably the most painful way to die. That this was very calculated, it was cold-blooded, it was done with malice aforethought, that the lynch victim would have his arms tied behind his back around a stake. Cotton bales would be placed around him. He would be wetted down so that the fire did not burn him up too quickly, and that he would be in agony for as long as possible. This was a Calvinist ritual. If you guys remember the Calvinists going back to the Puritan days, the idea was that the lynch victim needed to atone for the sins of the community, and it was this form of scapegoating, and all the sins of the community would be put upon him or her. So this is beyond grotesque. Now, how common was this? We don't exactly know. Civil rights organizations like the NAACP have scoured the records and tried to look into it, and they've come up with a number of roughly 8,000 lynchings they think took place during this time period. The government has a little bit lower of a figure. They have between 4,000 and 5,000. We don't know exactly how many because, again, these weren't really, they were documented by local communities, but no authority went down to the South and really documented all of them at the same time. Either way, it's rather alarming. So I don't want to give the impression that every Southern town had a lynching every week. After all, if you have to do it that much, then they don't serve their purpose. Their purpose is state terrorism. You want to keep the black community terrified of stepping out of line. You want 25 years, 30 years later, people to be telling young black children, don't do this, don't do that. I remember when Jim Johnson was lynched 25 years ago. It was the most horrible thing I ever saw, and that's going to happen to you too. They were supposed to be used very sparingly in order to just instill absolute sheer terror in the hearts and minds of black people. You might ask, why didn't black people arm themselves, form militias, try to fight against this system? Well, they lived in fear of their white neighbors who were much better armed, in better numbers, with more wealth, who would do unspeakable acts to them. Now, why weren't these things punished? Lynchings would be murder. They'd be against the law. No one was ever prosecuted for this kind of stuff. State governments felt that this was fine to do, that the lynch victim got what they deserved, and the federal government just ignored it. We're not in Reconstruction anymore, where the military is going to go into the South and prosecute this in the federal courts. They're not going to do that for a long, long time, until the 1960s and 70s. So, number one, you lived in sheer terror your whole life of ever stepping out of line. So therefore, you're going to live in a subservient position. You're never going to challenge the authority to move up, to make more money, to work at a business equal with a white person, because if you step out of line, you knew that you would die in just these awful, horrible ways. Second, letter B, economic dependence. This is enforced poverty on another community. Poverty has a form of oppression all its own. I mean, you get into these really interesting philosophical debates. What is freedom? I don't have the freedom right now to go and buy, tickets for my whole family to go to Europe because I don't have tens of thousands of dollars just saved up in the bank account. A rich person is freer than me because they have all these possibilities. They have money. A person that's educated has more opportunities, freedoms than a person who is